in a future hypothetical scenario between Taiwan and the mainland, even more so than the Russia-Ukraine situation, even more heavily outnumbered, outgunned, and in this case, dangerously so. Even on the technological front, China is the major purveyor and the center of the world in terms of drones and lots of robotics. So Taiwan has some catching up to do, but the nice thing about Taiwan is that it is embedded within the greater Western world. And I mean, not just geography, but in terms of it's a freewheeling democracy. It believes in the rules-based order that the US has helped establish before, and in being able to tie into the rest of the West.
Why doesn't Taiwan just put small-scale nuclear weapons in Beijing and Shanghai and say if there's a blockade or if we're just going to kill 50 million people?
If Taiwan wanted to become a nuclear power in the terms of weaponry, it easily has
right?
Technology, correct. Right. Taiwan has 4 nuclear reactors and was one of the early powers in civilian nuclear energy. What happened though was when it was trying to develop its nuclear weapons program, the US found out about it and put a stop to that. Again, because of the philosophy of non-proliferation and not exacerbating the situation across the strait. And perhaps it made sense back then, but I would argue that, again, look at Ukraine. Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, and now look at what happened to it.
Correct.
Now, the second that Taiwan falls, there is no longer going to be a credibility that the US is that world power.
I think that should give us courage, exposure to other people's perspectives.
It's moving us in a good direction.
Thank you for joining me for Conversations with Peter Boghossian. I'm not going to say your name. We're in Taiwan. Why aren't I saying your name today?
Well, I am ethnically of Chinese background, and I have business concerns all around the world, to a limited extent in China, but also have family members and relatives that have extensive concerns. So it's less about me personally as much as the fact that my family could be exposed. Not so much even in the present day. I think it's relatively calm now, but whatever may happen in the future is my concern, that it could be used against me.
And like, what would that look like?
Well, there have been known to be, for example, full-on kidnapping of people or extraterritorial sort of abductions and things like that, or people taken away for questioning, people being disappeared, things of that nature. And that's on the extreme end. On the less extreme end, there is also businesses that are affected. And at the core of it, I'm an entrepreneur. And so even if I'm not doing business directly with the mainland, the reach is pretty significant anywhere I go, whatever I do. And I'm here on Taiwan, and Taiwan is still intertwined in many degrees, business-wise. Even though they're trying to disentangle, there's still a lot of entanglements with the mainland.
So we have been told repeatedly by everyone we've interviewed, without exception, and people who wanted to come on the show, that once we do this, not only will I be prevented from going to China, or not only should I not go or may be prevented, but I shouldn't even go through the airport because of a quote-unquote extraordinary rendition, or because of a, so shall we say, extrajudicial kidnapping, or however you want to say that. And so everybody assures me that this threat is absolutely real. It's not imaginary.
Well, I think one only has to point to what happened a few years ago when there was a tit for tat, essentially extraordinary rendition or disappearing or basically sequestration, if you will, at the very least, of foreigners in China following the heels of the Huawei affair. So when the US clamped down on Huawei and also temporarily detained the daughter of the founder and CEO of Huawei, I believe in Canada, China did a tit for tat and basically jailed and imprisoned several Canadian contractors that, full-on Canadian citizens, right? So that's only a taste of what's going on now before any true full-scale conflict occurs. But you can only imagine what happens if this progresses on the track that it is on today in terms of additional friction and conflict, et cetera.
Yeah, okay, so we have a lot to talk about. Let's drill down to a few things. What are some issues you think we should talk about? Because I'm thinking we should talk about China-Taiwan relations. I'm thinking we should talk about what asymmetrical warfare would look like. Can we run with the latter and then go to the Chinese?
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about what you do and how you know about this stuff.
Right. So this is also where I'm trying to be a little bit protective of myself because I'm dealing in sensitive areas and sensitive technologies. I think that is the major currency of conflict today. It isn't so much purely ideological. It is a full-on economic and technological race. And I think there's a lot at stake there. Just like what I just mentioned about Huawei, that was about technology and economics, right? Intertwined with politics, of course, but it's not about political figures only anymore, is it? And I think that is also where today's frictions are occurring, right? It's about sanctions against AI and semiconductors. It's about technology. And I think that technologically, we're seeing the race unfold with the two major entrants being the US-led West and, of course, the Chinese-led rest, with Russia, China, and Iran creating another axis there. And I think this not only has impact economically, of course. We're seeing the wholesale revolution of AI redefining everything, starting with things like ChatGPT, but that's only the beginning. That's only the tip of the iceberg in terms of where the technology is leading. But it's also going to have a major effect in defense. And that is where some of the sensitivity only increases. So you're a valuable person if you're part of TSMC, and you're being recruited every which way.
What's TSMC?
TSMC is a Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. It is, by some accounts, the world's most influential, if not one of the richest, I almost said country, but richest companies in the world, but it's almost like representative of the country of Taiwan, if you will, in a sense. It is the major stay and major economic heavyweight and anchor of this island, and for the rest of the world, if you will, as well. Without the chips that TSMC makes, we wouldn't have our cell phones wouldn't be as full-featured as they would be, right? Our cars wouldn't run the way they should be, especially as everything veers towards greater, more complex electronics, like the Teslas of the world, right? Those are basically supercomputers on wheels. And to power that sort of compute requires the chips that TSMC makes for the world. And that is over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors comes from TSMC, comes from, a few blocks this way and up and down this island, basically. That's part of the importance of this island to the world.
And so are you work, and I'm trying to say this in a way that doesn't betray who you are and what you do, but you work in a kind of defense, kind of a military defense of the island. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. And so I think this is coming on the heels of what we've seen in Ukraine. I think on the heels of technological revolution in the spaces of robotics and AI, we see the prevalence of things like drones and other what we call asymmetric defensive technologies. So these are inclusive of drones and other forms of robotics, space and cyber and satellites, and also electronic warfare. And also, I would lump in information warfare in general, including information and misinformation. And I know, Peter, you're an expert on that. And we can talk about that too. But these are all forms that weren't traditionally didn't traditionally play as much of a role, perhaps, in the past, where it was all about hardware and who had the biggest and biggest guns. Right?
Aircraft carriers.
Right, and what we've seen is that small countries, the likes of Ukraine, which were heavily outgunned and was thought to probably, roll over within 24 to 48 hours, still be able to reasonably duke it out. Now, what the prognosis is, I don't know. I don't know that anyone really truly knows because it's still a very dynamically changing landscape. But what we do know is that they performed beyond expectation, at least in holding their own. They had to sacrifice land, yes, but they were still able to take out with what are called man pads, shoulder-mounted missiles that are, a few $100,000, they're still able to take out multi-million-dollar tanks, right? That is what is called asymmetric, because you are taking out something very expensive with something very cheap. And that is how you take down a Goliath while you are a David, right? And this is a similar situation with that we face in a future hypothetical scenario between Taiwan and the mainland. We're heavily, even more so than the Russia-Ukraine situation, even more heavily outnumbered, outgunned, and in this case, dangerously so. Even on the technological front, China is the major purveyor and the center of the world in terms of drones and lots of robotics. So Taiwan has some catching up to do, but the nice thing about Taiwan is that it is embedded within the greater Western world. And I mean, not just geography, but in terms of it's a freewheeling democracy. It believes in the rules-based order that the US has helped establish before, and in being able to tie into the rest of the West. And so in that sense, Taiwan hopefully can leverage that. And frankly, the rest of the West, including the US, can help also benefit from its interaction with Taiwan, not only by semiconductor chips, but also in the greater hardware supply chain and more, and also being part of that first island chain. So to answer your question, Peter, yes, drones, robots, AI, those are the sort of things that I'm dealing with now.
So I think there are two things to think about, and then subsequently talk about what that would look like: a blockade and an invasion. So my first question is, if there were a blockade, what would there be? Just massive numbers of drones hitting the ships, or what would that look like?
Yeah, so we had a taste of that with the Nancy Pelosi visit about a year and a half ago. And so they basically ran through a sort of a light version. It gave us a preview of what a blockade would look like, which is they declared all these areas off limits, and everything's within missile range, right? So literally all traffic had to stop. They stationed ships, but also lots of planes everywhere that were circling the island in a very tight configuration. They also had missiles going overhead directly in Taiwanese airspace. There has been, since the sort of unstated truce of 1949, when the two sides kind of separated, kind of an understanding there was a middle ground, a middle line that demarcated Taiwan from the mainland, and they violated that repeatedly, and also continued to do so ever since then as well. Before then, and now, of course, ramping up now. So what would it look like? Well, here's the nasty scenario. Taiwan, unfortunately, as one of its Achilles heel, 90% of its energy is imported petroleum. And that could easily be stopped. And however, Peter, the important thing to counter is that so as it goes for Taiwan, a lot of it also goes for China. A lot of its raw materials, and particularly energy, is also imported. Now, that's going to slowly shift as it ties together more closely with Russia, because eventually, I would assume there's going to be an oil pipeline built, but at least there's still the land bridge going on there. But for now, there's a lot that goes in through the ocean. And if the ocean is disrupted, it would disrupt both sides. So I think we have a little bit of time in that sense, that there would be blowback to the mainland if they were to enforce a full blockade. But there's also what we saw in the earlier instantiation in the Cold War, well, Cold War I, if you will, which is the Berlin airlift. Mm-hmm. And so you have the West with a capability potentially to run a blockade, whether it be by air, because they'd be saying like, hey, shoot me down if you dare, and if you're willing to, it may basically start World War III, or we're just going to have to run this blockade, whether by sea or by air. And Okinawa, Guam is still, not far, not close, but Okinawa is extremely close, right? And that is a major US base, along with the Philippines now being developed into another regional hub for US military bases.
Yeah, and there was interesting, it was that guy's name, Bongbong Marcos, unfortunate name,
Marcos,
but there were laws, as I understand it, against US bases being built there, and the way that he got around that was interesting. And so he's pro-US, and that in the Indo-Pacific theater has kind of shifted again, this is out of my area of expertise, I'm just kind of thinking through this, that has shifted the calculus for the likelihood of these occurrences. So I'm just thinking, so if there's a blockade and the main problem is energy, I assume they'll cut the internet cables as well.
Yeah.
Like, what does it look like? Just tens of thousands of drones, Taiwanese drones swarming, aircraft swarming. Like, what does that on the ground look like?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it would. They've already been doing testing on cutting internet cables in the sea, by the way. There's already
The Chinese is they.
They is Chinese, yes. The cutting the undersea cables, which is the mainstay of communication to the outside world. And unfortunately, in the case of Ukraine, there was the support of Starlink, but unfortunately in Taiwan's case, Starlink may not be relied upon because Elon Musk has, and Tesla, SpaceX, et cetera, has a lot of vested interest in the mainland. So Taiwan is trying to figure out a space-based communication strategy as well in the event of shutting down the sea lanes for information, which is very, very important. Because if you don't have information, if you don't have ties and connections to the outside world, then you're basically truly isolated, and the rest of the world can't even empathize with what's going on, right? But yes, the energy flows, the raw materials. Thankfully, this island can subsist on food and water for some time. It is, subtropical, therefore its ability to produce isn't as bad, but it's the energy needs and the data communication. It just wouldn't be able to survive very long without some sort of Western support. Let's put it that way.
What a grim scenario. And that's not even an invasion, that's the blockade.
That's a blockade.
So
yeah.
would you mind walking us through the invasion?
Yeah. So an invasion would have to be fairly massive to be effective. So I don't think there are multiple scenarios of some sort of slow infiltration. I don't think that'd be as tenable as sort of like a really big show of force. Probably also by air. A lot of people are focused on the amphibious by ocean, and certainly there is that possibility. But you also have to understand that they're building major air bases, including a major heliport that's within, stone's throw.
The Chinese.
The Chinese,
Where
yes. They being the Chinese, right?
Where are they building that?
Just right across the Taiwan Strait.
Wow.
And so if they could establish air dominance, and this is a big if, right? Then they would be able to transport freely at will without necessarily having lots of massive boats. Now, on the boat side, it's very interesting because not only are they known as having the largest navy on the planet now and continue to be building up, but they also have a civilian fleet that is at the whim and control of the central government there, right, of the CCP. And that civilian fishing fleet, ostensibly a fishing fleet, has already been wreaking havoc in places like the Philippines, for example.
Right.
And we've had run-ins with them doing all sorts of nefarious activities in the past couple of years. So it's not just the full Navy, it's the entire fishing fleet that they have at their civilian and military vessels that they have at their disposal.
Can drones hit aircraft and do significant damage, if not destroy them? Can you just send a swarm of drones? Mm-hmm. Or I have no idea, it's way outside my area of expertise. Could you just send a swarm of drones against a fighter jet?
A fighter jet moves very quickly. Again, kind of drawing to the experiences of Ukraine, mainly what's keeping the fighter jets grounded are actually the surface-to-air missiles. And Ukraine actually has the benefit of even older Russian technologies, the SAM systems, right? Yeah. And so that in itself has already been keeping, because the potential loss for those are, hundreds of millions of dollars a piece, right? And then the US has billion-dollar items in its arsenal as well, right? So we're seeing the asymmetry where there's a defender's advantage, where you have small systems that can really keep big systems out of the sky or the water or the land.
So it's in that sense, sorry to interrupt. So in that sense, it's kind of like a financial You're just wearing someone down financially. You're just making it so costly. It's like an attrition, financial attrition.
Yeah. Any significant conflict eventually boils down to a war of attrition, right? And it's about economics. And that is, again, where Taiwan won't be able to survive in the long run without some sort of aid or assistance or something of that nature. Now, it's not just drones, and there are many types of drones that are part of this whole asymmetric defense. It's the missiles, and it's also cyber, and it's also space, as I mentioned. And I think it needs to be developed on all fronts. Otherwise, you have a chink in the armor.
How much are those surface-to-air missiles a pop? How much do they cost?
They cost, so depending on the sort of the size and configuration and how far they go, the farther they go and the higher the altitude, the more expensive, and they'll be several $1 million a pop. But there are also close-range tactical systems that are, hundreds of thousands. Here's the interesting thing, because you mentioned it, is that drones, the micro drones, are only a couple thousand a pop, like on the civilian marketplace, partly because of the massive economies of scale that have been reached with the sort of civilian drone sector, right? Yeah, but that's mainly dominated by mainland China, right? So here's the thing, is that they're only a couple $1,000s a piece, and what we're seeing also in Ukraine is that these artillery shells that cost a couple thousand a piece, they're hard to get, and they're expensive, and no one produces them anymore. So what they're doing is actually almost using drones to replace artillery, because with these things, and they're using first-person view or FPV controllers, you can actually guide them to wherever you need to go. So they're almost like smart munitions in a sense. So yeah, we're seeing that wholesale change on the battlefield. And again, for now in the Taiwan situation, it's a game of deterrence. So if we can't demonstrate those capabilities, for all intents and purposes, that's an open invitation for conflict.
Are those, I've seen videos of the switchblades, and those just completely blew me away. Like, I simply could not believe how effective and when they shot straight up and they went down to the weakness of the Russian tanks. Are those technologies available here? This broader suite of technological innovations with...
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's both native indigenous Taiwanese products that are inspired, if you will, by American products such as the Switchblade. And partly it's out of necessity, because there are controls on technology even now. Like, many of those controls are diminishing as the US kind of slowly realizes the importance of Taiwan and the need for Taiwan to also be able to stand on its own two legs. And so Taiwan is trying hard, and it's trying to catch up in the technological arms race, both literal and figurative. Yes, there's both the Switchblade similar products. Those are called loitering munitions. Basically what they do is they float around and hover in the air, potentially for hours at a time if necessary, until they find a target and go dive bomb there. So yes, there are both native ones as well as things being supplied by the West that we may or may not know about, but that's certainly there.
And and I'm aware that this is a potentially uncomfortable question, but I'm asking anyway. The acquisition of nuclear submarines.
Yeah, I think that would be nice for Taiwan, but because Taiwan is developing its own indigenous submarine program and has actually launched it just late last year, its own, basically more than 90% of its components are now built on Taiwan, except for some other key components it wasn't able to master itself. Right? But that was a conventional diesel submarine.
Right.
Whereas the US has been pretty zealously guarding nuclear technology and has only released it within the framework of AUKUS, so Australia, UK, and the US, right? And that, of course, a couple of years ago, threw a big hullabaloo, given that Australia switched from French submarine technology that was contracted to buy to US collaboration on nuclear-powered subs. So I don't think that's probably in the offerings for Taiwan, unfortunately. But here's the...
why indigenous?
Why indigenous submarines?
Yeah.
Because no one will sell Taiwan without offending China. And the US is probably the only country in the world that doesn't near to fear China and can sell Taiwan essentially anything it wants. But the U.S. only has nuclear-powered submarines. It doesn't have diesel-powered. It is not. It gave up that technology, and other places like Europe are much better at diesel-powered submarines. So in terms of Taiwan, it is actually potentially advantageous, though, to go with diesel because they can potentially be quieter because they become battery-powered, right? Whereas a nuclear submarine it's like a mini power plant in there, and there's still, like, the US took decades to master this and make it very stealthy and very silent. So it's not an easy technology to master. So with area defense that as opposed to power projection, where you have to go for months on an end and go very long distances like the US does, nuclear technology is great for what Australia and for what the US is trying to do with just project. But if you're doing your own onshore defense, diesel technology is probably good enough if you can master that. But the problem is Taiwan has been barred from any defensive technology for fear of offending China. So that is partly why it's trying to play catch up.
Yeah, so I have a kind of out of the box question. I use these to help me think through issues. So what I can't understand is, so why doesn't, for example, the Iranians, why don't the Iranians sneak in tactical nuclear weapons to the United States cities, and if we launch some kind of a preemptive strike or what have you, they could just detonate them in U.S. cities? Why doesn't Taiwan just do that to put small-scale nuclear weapons in Beijing and Shanghai and say if there's a blockade or if we're just going to kill 50 million people?
So it's interesting. If Taiwan wanted to become a nuclear power in the terms of weaponry, it easily has
effortless, right?
Technology, correct. Right. And this is similar to places that gave up nuclear weaponry like South Africa, for example. Right. Because if you master civilian nuclear energy, it's not that hard to go into nuclear weaponry because all you have to do is release that energy all at once, as opposed to controlling it over time, right? In terms of civilian nuclear energy. So Taiwan has 4 nuclear reactors and was one of the early powers in civilian nuclear energy. What happened, though, was when it was trying to develop its nuclear weapons program, the US found out about it and put a stop to that. Again, because of the philosophy of non-proliferation and not exacerbating the situation across the strait. And perhaps it made sense back then, but I would argue that, again, look at Ukraine. Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, and now look at what happened to it.
Correct. They gave it up in the Budapest Accords in exchange for territorial sovereignty. Guarantees.
Guarantees from both sides.
Correct.
Which neither side has upheld.
Correct.
Right, yes.
So I understand the thinking, and I'm broadly sympathetic to this idea of non-proliferation.
Right.
You do, however, in the case of China, to be completely blunt, have a tyranny.
Yeah.
You have the CCP is more or less hell-bent. And I mean, the very fact that we have to blur you on this is the very fact that I can now no longer go into China is interesting.
Yeah.
But you have a bunch of thugs, and to capitulate to those thugs seems to me to be absolutely the opposite of what you should be doing. You should be standing up to them. You should be fighting them.
Right. I mean, in an ideal world, I think the U.S. would be at liberty to provide some of the weaponry on a lend-lease basis, much like, by the way, Putin is lending Belarus nuclear tactical weapons and has made a big deal of it. He's announced it, and he's free to, bandy that about as a leverage point. Oh, if you don't listen to me, I'm going to use nukes, right? So I hope and pray that it doesn't become that sort of situation. But if you think about it logically, why not? If you have a card to play, why wouldn't you play that card the way that Putin is, right? And so in this instance, I think it would make sense, frankly, because then it would increase deterrence. And again, what we're after, at least in this initial stage, is to figure out that deterrence equation so that they're not even tempted. China is not tempted to do something. And I think we're being potentially a little bit overcautious.
The only way to do that would be through nuclear weapons.
Yes, nuclear weapons is a major part of it, and failing that, it would be the asymmetric technology of the space, cyber, robotics, AI, etc.
Yeah, but even that wouldn't, if you snuck in 10 nuclear devices, nuclear weapons to various cities in China, that would do it. that would be enough of a deterrent.
That would be a huge deterrent.
I'm not advocating
Yeah.
that, to be clear.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that if you really wanted a deterrent, that would be it.
Yeah, that would be a deterrent. And then the other thing I've been hearing about is if hypersonic missiles were able to take out the Three Gorges Dam.
Right.
The entire vast plain and the population base there is upwards of 30 to 100, depending on how you calculate the area
Right.
of what would be sunk underwater after blowing up that particular dam. It would be enormous. Right.
Right. So the solution to this is to just not invade Taiwan.
Right. That would be the ideal. That is the nature of deterrence. If you do something to Taiwan, very, very bad things will happen to you in return, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And we promise to not do these things if you leave us alone.
Correct. Right. Yeah. But it has to be credible. And that's where
That's correct.
Taiwan does not have hypersonics. Taiwan does not have nuclear weaponry. The US is being cautious about it. I think there's a lot of talk behind supporting Taiwan, but where's the walk, right? Where are the actual technologies, weaponry, the actual substance of it? The US is in an interesting, precarious state of supporting many multiple conflict zones now and has depleted its own stockpiles.
Correct.
In fact, Taiwan is one of the only
even
countries that have
munitions, yeah.
prepaid for US weaponry, by the way.
Wow.
And by the way, Taiwan is one of the few countries that only can buy from the US because everyone else is afraid of China, right? So they can't. By the way, they bought some subs back a few decades ago from the Netherlands because the Dutch are very good at subs. And then, oh boy, did the Dutch, get the ban hammer and lots of pressure from China, and they will not sell anything to Taiwan ever again. So no middle power, no one that has significant business interests in China will ever do anything of that nature again with Taiwan, only the US. But the U.S. is in a state where it's still being very cautious, right? So there you have part of the conundrum that Taiwan finds itself. I think a lot of Taiwanese wonder, can we really depend on U.S. assistance if the shit hits the fan?
I can already tell you the answer to that is no.
Right.
Particularly if Trump gets in. I can guarantee you the answer to that is no. In fact, I was just reading something about that the other day. He's more or less said that. I can't remember where I read that piece, but he's more or less, again, I don't have a crystal ball. I think Trump is going to get in. I don't know that he's going to get in. Mm-hmm. Who do you think would be better for Taiwan, by the way, Trump or Biden?
Back in when Trump was in power up until 2020, I think that there were a lot of supporters here in Taiwan of Trump because he was one of the few U.S. presidents, or the first one, to really stand up to China.
Right.
And I think that won over a lot of hearts and minds back then. But I think this is now countered in recent times with sort of like trying to withdraw, right? To withdraw within the U.S. itself and take care of the U.S., which is understandable. But with regards to Taiwan, Trump has also said, we shouldn't have let the Taiwanese take the dominance in semiconductor technologies. We invented that technology. Yes. Taiwan has taken our jobs, etc.
And he's invested, I think, $1 billion in the Philippines, right?
Right.
U.S. Yeah.
Yeah. And then also there's basically this dynamic of whether there is a fear that Taiwan could essentially be sold to the highest bidder, right? In a sense, and the loss of autonomy that Taiwan would suffer in the future. So I think that I think there's still supporters of Trump, but I think there is more circumspection as well. Like, I think there's a lot of wait and see. There's also a feeling like Taiwan isn't in control of its own destiny entirely anymore. But it's trying desperately. If there is a way that it could be, whether by strength or projection, or be allowed to acquire the materials and technology it needs to adequately defend itself.
I would love to get somebody from the CCP on the show. We haven't tried to reach out to anybody. I have no connections there whatsoever. But I wonder what is the argument that they would make a kind of analog to the Monroe Doctrine, like this is in our hemisphere, don't fuck with us. Would they make a kind of similar argument that, what would they say? Like if I like steelman the position, someone from the CCP is sitting in that chair, and they say to me, what do they say about Taiwan?
Yeah, well, the CCP claims that Taiwan is an integral part of the Chinese nation. And that's from historical dynastic times, even though the CCP itself has never been in direct control of Taiwan. It is the inheritor of these, millennia, not just centuries, of Chinese dynastic rule. And it is also trying to finish what is essentially an unfinished civil war, right? And a division of people across the ages. So it's not dissimilar to East and West Germany, and they reunited, and what we also see in North and South Korea. So in that sense, they want to kind of finish the war and say, we won.
So could you talk a little bit, please, about the difference between democratic and authoritarian institutions and how that relates to China and Taiwan?
Right. I think that's where there was a beginning point, before the Civil War, with the fall of the dynastic system in 1911, which was the basis of this whole nationalism and where the conflict arose, right? And sort of from 1911 all the way to World War II, there was this soul searching about where the Chinese people would land. Would they become more communist, or would they become more capitalist, democratic, etc.? And I think what eventually happened was the red tide won out largely through Vietnam. The U.S. fought through that. The U.S. barely hung on to South Korea, if you look at the history. I mean, it was basically overrun down to the very tippy tip until it was finally pushed back to the 54th parallel. So I think if you look back the historical precedents, it was just sort of like that mass of people really wanting to account for the needs of the many, right? And to bring down what was perceived as elitism, etc., back then, right? Falling on the heels of this dynastic system of an emperor and what have you. So I find it ironic that communism has led back to an almost an echo of a dynastic system where you have this totalitarian ruler. And he harkens back to that. He basically positions himself as an emperor and is using a lot of the same language as the emperors of old would do. Whereas Taiwan has evolved very differently, not always by its own free will, frankly, partly because it's been dragged along in the greater West, along with South Korea and with Japan within the US-led rules-based order and this whole browbeating about democracy, etc.
Yeah.
Now, we can take all that with a grain of salt, and I think there is what many people call a democratic recession now, or skepticism about democracy these days. But I think for those that have tasted it, including here in East Asia, the Japanese, the Koreans, and the Taiwanese, I think there is a real feeling when we look across the strait and see the amount of control that society is undergoing, and especially with seeing what's happening in Hong Kong.
Right, exactly.
Where it was a freewheeling capitalist society under UK sort of norms and laws, now being wholesale converted. Just a few days ago, Xi Jinping created Article 23 in Hong Kong, which essentially quashed all areas of dissent, right? You basically now have to be conformist to the nth degree, or you'll be outed as a traitor to the country. And so I think that is the big contrast. If you turn on the TV channel right here in Taiwan, you've got a huge plethora of ideas, for better or for worse, right? Some people do actually, there is a small minority that do support the mainland because they feel, we are all Chinese and they've essentially won. Like, look at how big and successful they are. At least that carried more weight before. I think China is going through some issues today, but there are supporters of that, and they're allowed to say that, right? They're allowed to say, look at China. There are other supporters of, obviously, democracy. Taiwan is known as one of the most vibrant democracies in the world, not just in Asia. And part of that is because we actually have real turnovers in power. Like, before this current election, 2 elections ago, the ruling power really had to hang on and fight tooth and nail to keep power in Taiwan. And so that ability to keep the top accountable, I think, is the hallmark of at least pluralistic societies, if not democracies. I think a democracy is only one control system to keep accountability at the very top level. Whereas communism and totalitarianism, authoritarianism, there's no control. There's no one that can say anything to Xi Jinping of anything that matters. He basically is in control of the entire country. We know that, just like Putin is, and I think there is some substance to authoritarian versus plurality.
You know, you said so much there, but one of the things you said, my friend Melissa Chen has spoken about this in the past. You don't see any of the people who are freaking out about colonialism now repudiating any of the positions they held with regard to the UK's colonization of Hong Kong, right?
Yeah.
So if I may, I'd like to throw a curveball question
Sure.
at you at the possible risk of offending you.
I'd love it. Yeah.
Okay.
No, please.
Okay. So, given the potentially existential threat from China, what do you think about Taiwan becoming the 51st state of the United States of America?
So I'm of a biased opinion
Okay.
because I grew up in America.
Okay.
And so I love America as my actual home too, and I have a home there. I love Taiwan as my roots, as a second home, and as the home of my ancestors, etc. And I subsist in both worlds. So I'm biased in that opinion because I feel that the more China pushes hard to get at Taiwan and essentially, in my view, acquire Taiwan, the more that Taiwan needs to seek alternatives. So if you were to directly ask me and we
Yes.
held a plebiscite,
I am actually.
yeah, I would say, great, go for it. I wouldn't mind Taiwan being the 51st state,
I'm
to
actually
be honest.
very surprised to hear you say that.
Yeah.
I was worried I'd mortally offend you with that. But the more I think about this problem, the more I think that that's a potential solution to it.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure that the if we were to put aside like what the rest of the 50 states are thinking and the current internal conflicts and dynamics of the U.S., which I'm very cognizant of.
Yeah.
Again, I spend a large amount I float back between Taiwan and the U.S.
Yeah.
Right. I know the U.S. is going through a lot and going through its own form of soul searching, if you will.
Right.
And that there are
That'd be
deep
the
decisions.
nicest way to say it. We're sick. We're a country that's ill.
Right.
Yeah.
But you have to understand that the rest of the world isn't necessarily in a better position. And the rest of the world has some concerns, including being able to exist, right? Whereas no one will seriously say, I'm going to invade the United States tomorrow, right? That would be suicide, right? Not Russia, not anyone is actually saying that.
I can tell you, if you came in my neighborhood where I live,
Yeah.
everybody owns multiple firearms, multiple guns,
Right.
multiple. It would be, you would fight for every freaking inch of territory in my neighborhood.
Exactly. And I think that's well known. And I think, in a sense, the U.S. is untouchable from external forces. What it does internally is another matter, which is a deep conversation. But at least from this interplay on the global stage, the U.S. is untouchable. And to the extent, if you're a country like Taiwan that is fighting for its continuing existence, and there is an entity like the U.S. that would say, look, you could become a state and therefore you have states' right and you can have a reasonable amount of autonomy, not fake autonomy, as China has demonstrated with Hong Kong, right? It said, Hong Kong, you're going to be an autonomous zone. But what kind of autonomy has actually been served, right? So to the extent that there is actual credibility behind an actual union that helps secure you in the greater world stage and at least allows you to exist into the future, I think that's actually appealing. And people, if it was a serious option, I think there would be a significant contingent of people here that would vote for it. There are, of course, linguistic and cultural issues, but I think
with Puerto Rico, we can overcome those. Although that's far more similar to language, obviously. But
right, yeah. So I think if you look at Western institutions and organizations, whether it be the EU, how Ukraine is clamoring to get in the EU. It's a similar situation if that was even available. Obviously, that doesn't seem to be available now. But yeah, if there was an actual feasible way to expand the union, I think there would be many people signing up to apply.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate that our political class is not particularly nimble. I remember the moment I found out that Russia invaded Ukraine, my first thought was, let's brain drain the whole place. Let's just give hundreds of thousands of emergency visas and green cards to, let's drain the intellectual class of Russia. But there's no it's just a kind of stagnant morass, the thinking. I mean, that would be one of my first orders of business. I would seriously talk about Taiwanese becoming a state. Let me change gears and ask you about something else. I am deeply concerned, like the vast majority, and I don't say that lightly, of Americans, about the inability to close our southern border. Or not, let me take that back. Not the inability, but the fact that, and I don't want to make this political, I really try not to make these political, so I'm trying to think of how to say this without making it political, that the current leadership in the United States has a complete refusal to close the border. So lunatics, pedophiles, murderers, rapists, maniacs, anybody could be coming in. We have no idea who's coming in. We're not vetting anybody. It's a complete catastrophe. And again, this is not a fringe view. This is the vast majority of people. When you ask them, they're concerned about this. But one of the things, I interviewed Chris Martenson about this, and others who have gone down to, and Elon Musk is constantly tweeting about the border situation. Are you familiar that there are separate Chinese camps in Panama from before they go from on the road into the United States? And I was wondering if you knew about that and about the massive Chinese immigration, illegal immigration into the United States, and specifically why there are separate camps for Chinese people.
Yeah. So, yes, I am largely aware of both the southern border issue, immigration control, and by the way, I live close to the border in the US.
Okay.
Right? So I'm very much aware of these issues. I think it's an important topic to unpack. So let's take it first from the framework of a Taiwanese view of immigration and border control. Taiwan, like most of the East Asian countries, are actually pretty tight on border control. And for various reasons. But Taiwan has even more reasons than normal, which is Chinese infiltration. And right now, it is way harder as a Chinese national to come into this island than it is of almost any other nationality, including Taiwan has, by necessity, needs to make friends with other nations of various sizes, mainly small ones, right, that China will let it get away with and can't be pressured. So whether it be, places like it used to be Honduras, and that's gone now, and Nicaragua and what have you, and all these other sort of states that are all sizes and shapes, let's put it that way, right? So it's easier as a citizen of that country to come in on a visa. And the Taiwanese government is known for giving lots of student visas because they want people to kind of know and fall in love with the place. So especially with young talent.
I've fallen in love with the place, by the way.
Oh,
Travis has too.
Yeah, and yeah, that's fantastic. And most people that I know that come here really enjoy and do fall in love with the place.
Especially if you like food even a little bit, right? No,
Right.
but right? If you like food even a little bit, this place is paradise.
Yeah, and it's a vast melting pot of different cultures and cuisines. After the Civil War, it was like all the best folks from all the different provinces of China ended up here, and then it further melted it used to be a Japanese colony before it was reverted back to China after post-World War II, right? So there's Japanese influence, greater Chinese influence. There's, of course, very deep U.S. influence, as U.S. was the main security guarantor back post-World War II as well. So there's all of that. Now, again, on the immigration issue, a couple things to point out. Look, when COVID hit, one of the first things that Taiwan was able to successfully implement to its benefit was very tight border control. That included quarantines, that included no more flights from China mainland, period. Taiwan was one of the first to cut that cord and probably saved itself the greater brunt of whatever the hell happened right afterwards, right, at the very beginning stages. So it was one of these canaries in the coal mines to detect what was going on in that sector, in that space. So there was that, and there was also, in general, currently an ongoing fear of Chinese infiltration.
Exactly.
And there is actually one of the big hot items in politics now on the island is whether to grant the Chinese brides of many of the Taiwanese businessmen that did business in China and brought back brides, whether to grant them citizenship on an accelerated timetable compared to other foreign nationals.
Fascinating.
So yeah, that's absolutely an issue. I think if you were asked a normal Taiwanese on the ground, it'd be great. Of course, you need to control your borders. I mean, that's part of the livelihood of the nation, right?
If I were Xi Jinping, by the way,
Yeah.
my first order of business that I would do is I would infiltrate this place, take out the drone factories, do extraordinary renditions of people like yourself. I would kidnap all of the brain power specifically around the military, and I would sabotage all the drone factories. And then I would lay down ultimatums.
Right. And that is an ongoing fear of just infiltration because we are a vibrant democracy, so votes do count. So once you are of a full citizenship, then that matters. And what you'll see is China in terms of controlling its other areas. In particular, I'll point to Hong Kong again.
Yeah.
It basically flooded. It pushed out all the people that had ties to the rest of the world. It basically forced them out. And therefore, that's why you have a lot of these Hong Kong background folks that are running around in the rest of the world, not Hong Kong.
Correct.
And they flooded them with mainland Chinese into Hong Kong and essentially turned them into citizens. And that's a classic Chinese tactic.
Correct.
And,
They've done that, or they've done the correct.
Xinjiang, different places. They've basically done sort of this ethnic sort of like running over the local populace with their own loyalists, basically. So yeah, for Taiwan, border control and security is a major topic and issue. Now, with regards to the U.S., I want to say one thing about why there is an influx of Chinese. I think it's actually a testimony. Illegal, right. I think it's a testimony to partly the trials and tribulations that China's undergoing. It tries to present this bright and rosy picture of China on the up and up, etc. And to an extent, it still very much is. There's much to be said about what's going on in China in terms of its rise and ascendancy. But I think there's also a lot of people that value freedom and that are being suppressed and that want to get the hell out of there. And so they're finding any means necessary to get to different places, such as the US, being one of the top destinations, is also the EU. So I think, number one, the fact that we're seeing a greater rise in Chinese isn't necessarily premeditated from Xi Jinping saying, let's send a whole bunch of people there. But it's also a testimony to, again, the unrest that's slowly developing. And that could be to the detriment of the rest of the world, because if things go awry internally within China, Xi Jinping may be forced to make a big show, on the world stage just to, keep
A big
his
show
population.
of what? Like, what do you mean?
Big show of force, like to go and invade a different country like Taiwan in order to settle his own domestic issues as a distraction and also a way to rally his own forces, because now that necessarily becomes a showdown with the West, and that necessarily kind of riles up that national spirit, right? It's like, oh, okay, we're being, hunted down by the imperialist West, so we've got to go rally ourselves as Chinese nationals, et cetera, and stand up to them. That sort of thing would distract from all the internal issues that China is going through. So there's a real danger. There's a lot of people say too good of a China that's too strong and powerful is bad for the greater world, but neither is a messed up China that's totally weak and chaotic and now is forced to go do crazy things, right? Just to distract itself from what's going on internally as well. So we're in that middle ground right now, but it could easily veer one way or the other, and we shouldn't make any assumptions. Let's put it that way.
Okay, so let me ask you this then. When people found out that we were coming here for 5 weeks, other than the people who know that I love to eat, they would, no, like really serious when I say that. So they would say to me like, why are you in Taiwan? Like what is possessing you? What is motivating you to go to Taiwan? So my question to you is, What do you have to tell the people of the United States in general and in the Anglosphere, more generally still the UK, Australia, etc.? Why should anybody care about Taiwan?
Right. Well, I think there's multiple angles here in terms of the importance of Taiwan to the world. I think there is the very base material, right, aspect where Taiwan is the purveyor of major important civilian technologies like semiconductors. It's also the home of Foxconn that makes you all your iPhones. It is such an important critical piece of the world economy. Now I realize that the world is starting to decouple, and there is this push to do manufacturing onshore back in the US, etc. And as someone who's also spent significant time in the US, I understand that and I can sympathize with that. And Taiwan can help there too, because Taiwan is such a small place that it's always looking for places to invest. And the Taiwanese are one of the masters of the manufacturing and material world, of putting things together. And my family immigrated to the United States on the heels of that. My father built factories on both sides of the border in the US and in Mexico. And I think the Taiwanese, ironically, were the ones that helped build up China back when that was the thing to do, because it was the great capitalist opportunity, right? And the rest, along with the rest of the West, rushing headlong into China, investing in China, building up China, Taiwan was there building factories. And now that it has to pull out a lot of factories, now that it's fearful of its money, where it's going to go and where to invest, Taiwan can also invest in helping to build factories in the US. And we're already seeing that with TSMC, the semiconductor manufacturing in Arizona, and that's only the tip of the iceberg.
Okay, so just for the people who are watching this, who are still baffled by why we're in Taiwan. If there were a Chinese blockade or takeover of Taiwan, what would the average person in the U.S. would they notice that? Would it mean anything to them?
Yes.
Should they care?
The average American would feel a huge impact in their wallets, in the availability of goods that they would be able to buy, and it would also mean the final nail in the coffin for America as a world power, which has implication on its economics. So let me get to that in a second. But
please
first,
tell me about the wallet thing, though. Like, what would that mean? What would be more expensive for them?
Right. So America, the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. All countries essentially are forced to deal in US dollars, even if they have nothing to do with America. Like 2 third world countries are still going to deal with US dollars because it's currently the most stable. So you wouldn't want to deal in any other currency at this current juncture in time for fear that it would devalue or overvalue or whatever, basically fluctuate and be very volatile. But the US dollar, for whatever reason, mainly because it's the world's major preeminent power, it's stable. Now, the second that Taiwan falls, there is no longer going to be a credibility that the US is that world power, because the US has placed so much emphasis on that, on the world system, on the rules-based order, on the global supply chain, etc. So that may shift in the future, like as, for example, Taiwanese, as I mentioned, invest more and become more resilient and put more things, and more nearshoring and factories go back onshore in the US, but that takes time. If it were to happen tomorrow, there would be a major, major impact. And again, you wouldn't be able to buy your cars. You wouldn't be able to get things. Anything with a chip in it would probably be blocked and would be probably 3 times, 4 times, 10 times more expensive, if not impossible to buy, because the chips aren't there, if this were to happen now. And then on the world stage, the US dollar would tumble, because it would not necessarily be the world's reserve currency, where the rest of the world values the US dollar as that stable bedrock upon which global trade rests, right? So for that sake, I think the US average citizen would feel a great impact. And so it is in their material interest to do so. On another dimension, I think America has a vested interest in maintaining the peace, at least in Taiwan's situation. You have to pick your battles. So I'm not saying that the US needs to be a world's global cop and go everywhere in the world as it has in the past. But I do feel that Taiwan is of strategic interest to the United States. And oh, by the way, unlike, say, Middle Eastern autocratic powers, and if you're going to make a big hoopla about democracy and freedom and this, that, and the other, well, Taiwan is about as good as it gets as a role model for democracy and freedom and whatnot, right? So that is where the credibility thing is a true test. If you're not even going to defend that because you've made such a big hoopla about it, then why should I take you, the US word, seriously, right?
That's a great, I don't know. I don't know after Afghanistan and the pull, I cannot answer that question. I could have answered that question 25 years ago. But I can no longer answer that question.
Right. And so we hope not to be, Taiwan hopes not to be the next Afghanistan or Vietnam or kind of the mess that's still remnant of the greater Middle East, right? And all the simmering things that are going on and the tribal rivalries and what have you. If anything, the Taiwanese just hope for, at the very least, a maintenance of the status quo, that it can go about its daily life.
But even with that, you have the specter of a blockade or invasion hanging over you. Like that, this has been a generational threat now.
Yeah.
I mean, it just must be horrible for the psyche of a people that when you have a tyrant and a bully constantly threatening to kick the shit out of you. I mean, that has to have a detrimental psychological effect on the populace. I mean, it has to.
You would think that, but it's really interesting because this isn't a today issue. This is an issue that's actually existed since 1949, since the separation of the two sides and the establishment of essentially an independent Taiwan under the current lineage of the government, right? And so it's always been embedded there that there was this, our cousins on the other side of the strait are doing their thing, right? I mean, we've lived through lots of crazy things going on the other side, including the Cultural Revolution, including Tiananmen Square, including all sorts of things, right? But thankfully, not a really, really big shooting war yet. So I think that's where the fear is. But so you're right there that there's an increasing fear, but there always has been this history for going on 70 years of friction. And I think if you ask the Israelis the same question, if you ask even Ukrainians in Kiev, like life has to go on and you can't necessarily live fully in fear and not do anything and be paralyzed, otherwise nothing would get done.
Yeah.
And then the enemy wins.
Okay, so you've been very generous with your time. I appreciate it. I have one more question I've been thinking about. I'm pretty sure it was proposed by the presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy. I've mentioned it when I was on, I think, Taiwan Plus and another show the other day. What do you think about the idea that Taiwan adopts its own kind of Second Amendment and then we arm everybody with a gun in Taiwan?
Yeah. Yeah, I thought that was interesting.
You're really nonplussed by my questions. You're not like mortified by them or anything.
I've actually thought about them as well.
Okay.
When Vivek actually, I was there when, not physically there, but I remember it making the news when Vivek suggested that, right? I will say it's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
But there's pluses and minuses.
Okay.
And as someone who grew up in America, I get the Second Amendment. And I'm actually considering firearms, I mean, especially in this industry. Like, come on. Like, how am I not going to get firearms?
Well,
right?
I mean, if I were you, man, I'd like be totally
totally
walking
under
around
the
with a
teeth.
concealed carry. I'd be having, yeah.
Exactly. So I get it, and I get the Second Amendment, I get its protections, and I get also how it makes America essentially like this place that is untouchable, right? Like we covered earlier. So to the extent that would be a good idea for Taiwan, maybe, and it's worth considering. But maybe there's pluses and minuses as well, because at the same time, and this may be blown up in the rest of the world, but when we look at gun violence in America, and especially for me as having a family with kids, what's going on even in the schoolyards and things of that nature, that is also of concern too, right? So there's this plus and minus thing where in Taiwan, at least you don't have to be fearful of gun violence between people. But at the same time, that's at the cost of some degree of resilience and being untouchable, right?
Yeah.
So what I would say is potentially a middle ground is that you have armories that are essentially can be opened up, and that there's mandatory training, and that
I
there's
was going to say you
Israeli-
have to have mandatory training. You can't just have armories like people have to.
all males are have compulsory conscription, so all males must serve in the military here. But whereas in recent times it became kind of a joke, where it was almost like, first of all, it went from 2 years down to 1 year, down to 4 months of mandatory service, and those 4 months were spent like sweeping the street or doing some sort of community service. It was a joke. That's now being re-upped to 1 year and potentially going to be re-extended even further. Potentially, some people are looking at the Israeli model where both male and female serve, and for significant periods of time, and it's a real deal. You learn some real skills and techniques as necessary, right? And I think that would be interesting for Taiwan. And I think it would be interesting to be able to arm the citizenry in that regard once you go through the training and you know how to handle these and you're demonstrated as a responsible citizen, right? So in that sense, I think there might be a middle ground. I don't think we should teetotal to absolutely not being able to arm up as necessary, but it shouldn't. I'm not sure that it would be Taiwan would be ready to just open the floodgates immediately overnight, because that takes time, right? And that's a huge cultural dynamic and shift.
Final question. Is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't ask you, or anything on your mind you just want to throw out?
Peter, you know where to find me. Anytime you want to call me up and ask me a question, I'm here for you. I'm a huge fan of what you're doing, and also what you're trying to espouse in terms of critical thinking, especially. I think that's the critical ingredient, no matter what. Regardless of our material circumstances in the world, what we have are our own minds and our own agency, and we need to be better at it. And I think you are a great force in pushing us to be better versions of ourselves through critical thinking.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you to say. Thank you. I appreciate that. All right. Well, I'm not going to say your name, but I will say thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.